Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak at the end of the conference. It allows me to perhaps look back on sort of 25 to 30 years of wrestling with these issues through the lens of the discussions we've had in the last couple of days from people who are even more experienced at this than I am, right to the ones who are starting their careers, and good luck. See what you were saying in 30 years' time. I was thinking that I was, in fact, a student at Magdalen College. I had a supervisor at Magdalen College who was a successor to Gilbert Ryle, Ralph Walker. And while, at least by the mid-80s, it had got to the point where people were too polite to say there was no such thing as Indian philosophy, at least to my face, it was clear that there was a certain reluctance to think that serious philosophical work could be done from those materials. And this was literally at the time when the Spalding Professorship at All Souls College was occupied by Bimal Matilal, who was at that very point discussing these issues with the giants of Oxford philosophy of the time, like Michael Dummett, Peter Strawson, and Derek Parfit. So it's not new, and I fear it won't go away for the foreseeable future. We've had a few presentations which have looked at the very large issues. We've also had very detailed and, for me, very enlightening sort of focused discussions about presentations on pedagogical practice. What I want to say now is a sort of a mezzanine level set of reflections focused on the idea that actually Lloyd wanted me to talk about, which is this incredible resistance that seems to still be there, albeit often under the surface, for students to do something called Indian philosophy or comparative philosophy or whatever else it is, which isn't simply, frankly, upfront Western philosophy, especially analytic philosophy in this country. And so you're saying, well, what is it that stops students from thinking there isn't philosophy if it isn't Western? For whom that old idea of Anthony Flew and others of simply saying there isn't anything called philosophy outside the West. What do you do with them? Where are these ideas coming from, and how do you respond to them? So I want to give broadly a kind of a threefold analysis of the reasons why we have this situation that ostensible justifications are provided for why philosophy is in fact a Western enterprise. And the response to each of them, I think, pedagogically, not the larger intellectual context about what we write and what we do our research on, but what do we do in classes. The responses, I think, perhaps will lay out in the space of a few minutes some of the challenges we face and that we have already, I think, glimpsed in these last 2 days of discussions. So what are the three main kinds of reasons that have been given, and that to a large extent is part of a pervasive culture in which, if anybody thinks about philosophy at all, thinks of it as this uniquely Western enterprise? The most presentist one, and this is something that was brought up by Tim Williamson, the Winfield Professor of Metaphysics at Oxford, in this debate that Lloyd mentioned a few weeks ago. The very presentist one is to say, look, analytic philosophers take themselves to be doing something akin to science. So we are asking questions. These questions are simply about human reality, and our answers to them must constantly be seeking to push the borders of knowledge. So there's this very scientistic idea. And the scientism does two things. One, it says, we're not being particularly prejudiced about China or India or the Islamic world. We don't even look at the Greeks. We don't look back at the past at all. At least we are equal rights discriminators against the past. We just look at the questions as they occur to us now. So that's one way in which the very question of where the materials come from outside this kind of analytic tradition is parked, so that you don't even have a chance of saying, Nyaya says this, or we find in Mohism. You can't even get there. So then you're called upon to play a particular kind of role and response, and I'll turn to that when I look at these, the pedagogical responses to that question. The other thing that this kind of response does, apart from shoving out the past, is to explicitly mold itself in this ostensibly culture-free zone. Because what it says is, if we are like the sciences, then we are asking the questions in a kind of perpetual cultural vacuum. We can ask these questions and we can seek these answers. And if philosophy is done that way, then anything that isn't put in terms of solutions to problems and disproofs of existing supposed solutions, nothing that fits into that model will count as philosophy. So that's one thing. The second, which is a kind of a medium-term historical answer, and it is something that I think is particularly played out in continental philosophy's own forms of resistance to opening up the curriculum, says that philosophy as it is done now is a unique triumph of European modernity. Familiarly starts from something like Descartes and Grosseteste and so forth, and is a giving up of the darkness of the medieval past, in which philosophical questions were located in religious contexts, and if, especially with Islamic thought and Indian thought, these questions arose out of a terminology which was already, as it were, theological, then Europe has moved on from it, whereas these other traditions have not. Therefore, we can put them into the realm of the history of ideas, but not in living philosophy. To some extent, that is also used in the Anglophone world, but in a less elaborately historiographical way. What that does is to say, we continue to ask questions which are cutting edge and forward-looking, but we'll help ourselves to a particular set of early modern ideas. So we talk about perception, we'll talk about Molyneux's problem. If we're talking about theories of unitary consciousness, we'll talk about Hume's bundle theory. We're not going to actually slog our way through 18th century writing in English, never mind Descartes in Latin, but we will help ourselves to those ideas simply because they happen to have been the only times and the first time these kinds of presentist questions were asked. So the very notion of European modernity is that already by the 17th century, questions are being asked which only happen to be located in the 17th century. They are questions which are alive today. You don't stop working with Newtonian mechanics just because you've got quantum mechanics. You don't stop working with Descartes and Hume just because you have Quine and Davidson. So you do have this kind of medium-term looking back on modernity in slightly different versions, as I said, in a much more elaborated historiographical manner in the continental tradition, and in this sort of mealy-mouthed way in the Anglo-American tradition. And so if that's where it happened, and philosophy now in the academy is this modern enterprise par excellence, then of course it stands to reason that the rest of the world, which did not go through that transformation into modernity in the unique way Europe did, obviously didn't have philosophy, so you can't study it in that context. And then you have the third and sort of the classical argument, the deep argument, which of course begins with, ever since Aristotle, or perhaps ever since Plato, but really Aristotle for that argument. And that, of course, is to say that in some profound way, the work that was done in what is now roughly Greece and its environs 2,000 to 2,500 years ago is uniquely inherited by a particular kind of conception of the modern West. Therefore, the particular historical experience of articulating questions about humanity and reality that occurred in that trajectory from the Greeks is the only way of doing philosophy, and also the only way of doing philosophy has a particular kind of narrative link to that Greek past. So you have these three arguments with deeper, ever-deepening temporal perspectives. And so I would suggest that that's the reason, these are the kinds of reasons that inchoately slosh around when you have popular books on philosophy, or indeed discussions about philosophy at philosophy festivals, and whether it's particularly articulated in that way or not, whether it is found in the A-level syllabus, ever-changing A-level syllabus or not, the idea that undergraduates often come to when they take philosophy degrees in most places involves a combination, sometimes self-contradictory, between these three kinds of ways of thinking. Of course, they are also much more clearly and often quite energetically, even aggressively articulated by academics themselves who count themselves as Western philosophers. And so obviously that's going to feed into the classroom, it's going to feed into how the curriculum is structured, it's going to go into generations simply having this kind of background put behind what is explicitly taught. Now, in responding to this, I myself tend, and in my response, I think, to Joel yesterday, I think one side of the way I try and hold these contradictions together came to the fore. I myself find that I'm tempted by two different ways of looking at the problem, as it were. The one is, I suppose in its, I would say in my most critical moods, I would say it's a kind of a consumer model problem. You're going to have universities wanting more students in your undergraduate courses. You've got to find new ways of getting them to come and increase the numbers in your department. So let's find new ways of marketing what philosophy is. Why don't we do global philosophy, multicultural philosophy? We need to get them to buy in to this view. And of course, in its more noble form, it could be, as an anonymous author wrote for the obituary of Bimal Matilal, it could, of course, take the form of evangelizing for the riches of one's philosophical culture. So you might really think that it's something that needs to be done, that there is an inherent good in getting people to listen to you. In a slightly more debased form, it'll be, we need to get these people to listen to us. So there is one motivation that we tend to have, where we think, we really do need more people to do this, because it's good for us, it's good for them. But there is the other kind of response too, and I think that sometimes it's played out in the places in North America particularly, where if anything of Indian philosophical content in particular is taught, it tends to be taught in departments of South Asian studies, languages and cultures, places where actually Indian philosophy is really doing philology on philosophical texts. And to some extent, I do, while I'm often flat out irritated by this refusal to let the ideas live, do that necessary disembedding which is philosophical practice by these kinds of programs and academics, there is also a certain kind of, I think, nobility to an endeavor which says, look, these are deep, dense, complex materials, and we need to work with them on their own terms. And you really wouldn't be able to do the same with with Galen or with Aristotle or with the Latin Stoics, for example, without similarly embedding yourself in that kind of work. And I think that there is some amount of attention that should be given to sustaining the linguistic and philological demands. It wouldn't have escaped you that people who were actually giving these talks were absolute scholars of, say, classical Chinese or Sanskrit. And in a way, we need to ask ourselves, well, how much of that is necessary outside the question of having 50, 60 undergraduate students a year? How much of it is necessary for teaching, perhaps at graduate level, perhaps at doctoral level, but in a way for sustaining the teaching in these fields? There, I think there is a different kind of problem than we face with the shallower historical questions that I'll turn to soon. In a sort of paper, an essay that has gained a lot of traction in the online classics journal Eidolon, Chakravathi Ram-Prasad, who I confess is my son, wrote recently about what he calls a decolonized ancient world studies. And of course it has emerged in his lifetime of discussing these ideas with me, but I criticize him for letting philosophy get away too easily, because he says, look, it is self-evidently the case that if you think of philosophy as this enterprise of inquiry, you can't simply say there is only such a thing as Western philosophy. Whereas the classics has a particular problem. It is structurally the treatment of the idea of the ancient world as the Greco-Roman world. It is the idea of the classics as, in fact, culturally restricted. And a lot of my sort of philosopher friends have said, I think he's giving us too easy a pass. But the point about a decolonized ancient world studies is not so much that you restrict the Greco-Roman culture to sort of Mediterranean culture studies. It is that there is an institutional privileging which says you have a classics department with no further qualification of what the classics means, whereas you have to go look at areas, that is to say, geographically limited, localized, specified areas, even if they are as vast as the Islamic world or China or India, and then or South Asia, and you say, there you've got to do the whole lot of activities that you might think of as classical, but isn't this. Now, it has actually been the case, I think, that when it comes to doing philosophy in some of the, at least in the case of Indian thought, with these languages and civilizations courses, the institutional problem there is that there is the asymmetry between saying, when you look at the Greek and Latin philosophical writings, you do it as part of an uninflected universalist notion of philosophy. Because you do philosophy there like you do archaeology or history or literature, but that is philosophy. Whereas when you look at, say, the Sanskrit materials or Pali, you don't go with the content of the ideas being applicable or having universalist pretensions or aspirations. You rather think of it as texts that were written in a particular time, in a particular social and cultural context, which are then studied for their grammar and the ideas that concern those thinkers then. So they remain trapped. So if you're going to decolonize ancient world studies, what you need to do, and I think this argument applies as much to the philosophical parts of the classical traditions as much as it does to classics in general, what you need to do is to say that you need a larger notion, an expanded notion of the classical tradition. You simply need to say, does not matter where these ideas coming from, the important point is those ideas continue to be relevant to us today. A question we don't ask of Aristotle, but we do of the Milinda Panna, or we do of Shankara. It's not only the case that these ideas live today, and that's what makes them philosophical, but it is necessary at some irreducible level to have to hack your way through those languages and see the context. So, yes, you can embed Aristotle. Yes, you can disembed Nagarjuna, but you need to have a way of sustaining the study of these texts which does not make a difference between what is classical and what is not. So I think that in response to this idea of the unique philosophical inheritance of the Greeks, you do need to decolonize classical philosophy as much as other areas of the classics. And that does involve, in some way, a certain kind of demanding encounter, and it will change according to the level at which we teach, the institutions in which we teach, a point in our careers where we are, we are motivated to do one kind of teaching or the other. There must be, at some point, an irreducible commitment to working the challenges of language, even if it is in translation. And we had a couple of good examples of that yesterday. We need the challenges of translation to be up front and to say, look, the ideas from the Greeks does not come unmediated. You've got to work through those. In the same way, you have that coming from Mengzi, or you're coming from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So that's I think, the kind of curricular response we need to handle the deep history of philosophy, objection to philosophy being seen as anything outside the West. When we move to the second kind of resistance that is offered for widening out philosophy, which is to say there is this idea of a unique kind of birth of philosophy as an academic discipline in European modernity. There we have a couple of things to do. And I think part of it is also made more difficult by the way that much of sort of Indian, Islamic, and Chinese philosophy, in particular the classical traditions, have gone about opening up comparative or fusion or intertraditional philosophies. It is that characteristically we tend to, when working across traditions, one of the sort of most deep-rooted kinds of responses we've had in our writing and in our teaching is to compare the works from sort of the older centuries, the previous centuries, going back 2,500 years, 2,000 years, 1,500 years ago, to ideas found characteristically in the 17th, 18th, to 19th century in Europe. So there, most of us have tended, whether we've articulated it specifically or not, to try and go around this objection about philosophy in the academy today as this enterprise of European modernity by saying we are conceding that notion of philosophy as it happens, and that's just what the enrollment numbers are, and that's just what the publications in those fields indicates. But what we are going to do is to bring that material bring our materials from these other kinds of periods into philosophical conversation with early modern European thought. And I can't, in a way, see how to get around that. It really is the point that when you see in Vasubandhu an argument for something that looks comparable to something like a denial of a unitary conception of the subject over a temporal period, you are thinking, well, where does that get articulated in the West to become such a big argument now? Well, it's found in Hume. So before you know it, you're finding a conceptual reason to make these kinds of comparisons. And I do that all the time. And I find that, of course, pedagogically compelling because the students are willing to receive that as a kind of first point of contact with these kinds of materials. However, of course, I do think we are making life a bit more difficult for ourselves because we are, in a way, trying to smuggle into a particular narrative of modernity ideas that, of course, had their own history and their own context. I don't have any easy answers, and I'm sure many of us have experimented with some of these things. One of the things, of course, we do very often is to flip the thing around and deliberately estrange these European materials and say, well, do you see how they came to these ideas? Do you see these particular ways in which they are articulating these questions? Sometimes, especially, for example, with the case of Descartes, something that I've been working on for a long time, you don't even need to think that these are the fundamental and irreducible ways of analyzing human reality in terms of a mind-body divide, in terms of the securing of against skepticism of an external world. These questions are not natural. It's not necessary that you must think that human beings are simply a mind-body duality which must then somehow be overcome. Plenty of these other traditions don't do that at all. They are still talking about perceptions, reflexivity, self-consciousness, knowledge, all kinds of action, all kinds of issues, but they are innocent of the way in which philosophy gets going in Europe in its self-conscious breaking with the medieval past. So, in a sense, we say there are alternative ways of doing the philosophy which does not turn on this modernist assumption about how philosophy is born in the academy, in a recognizable modern university. You're saying that those questions are not the inevitable historical precursors that you can provincialize, you can estrange the reader from those kinds of questions. And I think that it does get students fruitfully confused when they encounter the Western material after they have started thinking through the Indian material. And we saw with Eleni what has happened when she was talking about Lancaster University, because we have this slightly weird Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion, and the religion department has got people like me and Brian, and we've got other people and we've got Sharuk Naguib, who works on Islamic materials. We have, in a sense, a ready-made bunch of people working in non-Western philosophies. And right from the first year, they're encountering us and they're encountering our PhD students. So this idea of saying, yeah, why don't we go to Pratyabhijna to ask about the question of perception? You get them at 18, they think that is perfectly possible. Of course, it's self-selecting because you need to think that Lancaster is the place to come to in the first place, so that's a different issue. But if you set aside the recruitment, the base questions about recruitment and look at it simply as this pedagogical principle, you can see that students respond in that way. But then we have, I think, the third, and for me, the most difficult, the most intractable of questions, which is the idea of philosophy as presentist, as living on the edge of time, always looking to the future. And they're the kind of intellectual points we've all made, and some of us have written about, which is to say, no, this doesn't act in a vacuum. This goes back, generation after generation. You're asking these questions. The way in which analytic philosophers think about, the problem of apperception goes back to the way Peter Strawson articulated it in the 1950s from his slightly sort of creative engagement with Kant in an English translation, which until then of Kemp Smith, which had until then received very little interest because, of course, Strawson didn't read German. There's a very particular question. You're asking that question as if the notion of apperception, the notion of a psychological unity or whatever, or the notion of the geometry of perception, they just popped up in your idea full-born. It's just not true. Nor is it actually, can it be modeled on the sciences, because here you have, in a way science does not do, a deliberate elision of the past, as if these ideas can be thought and new without any of the historical past. But that argument, which many of us make, has no traction, of course, with the students. That's a battle we're still fighting with our academic colleagues. Students, what do? And I think here is where some of my agonizing about language and the textual basis of these materials really comes up, because it's noticeable that, especially where analytic philosophers have taken most notice, say, especially with Indian materials, that I can speak about, they've tended to do so with research that articulates questions in terms of what is being asked in analytic philosophy now, and to which an idea inspired from Indian materials is presented full-blown. So in effect, what is happening is the most effective kind of research when it comes to getting analytic philosophers to even pay attention to Indian philosophy has been one that implicitly buys into the presentist notion. Say, well, of course, this comes from a 4th, 5th century thinker, but we are going to all the time signpost what we are reading of this thinker in terms of 20th century and 21st century figures. So you can forget about the past. I'm just establishing that that's where I'm coming from. And it is also that kind of material that probably pedagogically works the most, because it has the least kind of fundamental psychological challenge to the student when it comes to saying, okay, I've come here asking about what are the debates about the self. And basically, I want to start with what happened since reasons and persons. So that's what I know. What are you going to give me? And if you're going to say, yes, this is the Buddhist argument, not quite as Parfit made it, let's get it here from Dharmakirti, okay, that's fine. It's all right, because what you're going to say is, what Dharmakirti does is, and then you proceed to give it the gloss in terms of how the debate proceeded in the critiques of Parfit. So I do think that we are seeing, in a way, for good or bad is not the point, we are seeing, in a way, the birth of a particular kind of philosophy. And I've had some of the more textually grounded scholars of Chinese thought say the same thing to me about some of the people whose work has become much more quoted and sort of recognized, which is this presentizing of the Indian or the Chinese materials, to say it is here already. You can you can divorce the past of this Indian material as much as you can of the Western. Now, is that effective? Probably. And I can see that if I have an hour and a half in which I'm going to discuss self-no-self argument, this is the way to go. Give them one reading, a page each, put them to work in a workshop and ask them to discuss it, and say, this is where the idea is, can you see in this translation or my own translation, where I find myself saying, the translational choices here are aligning ever more with the Western, contemporary Western analytic ideas with which it's supposed to be read together. I see myself doing that, but pedagogically that becomes the most accessible when you've got an hour and a half with 19-year-olds who've got 4 other modules to do that term. But what will that do to the creation of a continuous hermeneutic link to the past? Long ago, Jiten Mohanty asked this question: what is alive and what is dead in the Indian past is something we must continually ask ourselves. And I think since he asked that question in the early 70s, we are seeing not so much the rebirth of what was dead, but rather the birth of a new kind of philosophy, which is bringing into existence in this world of the global academy a kind of a philosophy which helps itself conceptually to the past, but also tells a narrative about itself to the future. And I would like to have, sort of perhaps the time we have for discussion to have people's views on whether, we think that's most effective. One advantage that it has is perhaps it addresses something that has been bubbling away under the surface here. And I would like, again, to have people's views on this, which is that I do think that we have different kinds of moral, but also pedagogical challenges when we think about the rubric of multicultural philosophy. The kind of argument which says, Plato really is as much an Egyptian as he is a European thinker. In fact, much of classical European thought Greek thought was almost reinvented, written anew by Persians and Arabs. And the density of medieval Islamic philosophy on Plato is, in fact, far greater than anything comparable in Europe at that time, or even afterward, even after the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. So the kind of question that is said that informs the way we look at these kinds of dense, textually elaborate, and highly elitist materials is very, very different from when we are thinking about how to decolonize philosophy today, when we are talking about the plurification of ethnic or gender identities and other forms of cultural activity, and open up the idea of what philosophy itself means. When we had this debate, this very bright lecturer in international relations, Nivi Manchandani, she made this point that, look, Western philosophy, she said, is racist. It has certain kinds of prejudices built into it historically. And of course, we could talk about what we've already seen, what Kant said, or Hegel said, or Frege said, and so forth. And I felt compelled to point out no more than what the Brahminical thinkers thought about the rest of the world. So Indian philosophy, especially the sort of Hindu philosophy, is absolutely shot through with prejudices, and those are not prejudices of the past, as contemporary Hindu nationalism amply shows. The difference, of course, is that in the Western academy, nobody ever encounters the Mahabharata without first being told how deeply sexist it is. Not the first point of explanation when you encounter Aristotle. So there is still some way to go. However, even if we go past how people teach these materials, I think that we are in an unprecedented time in history when thinking abstractly is no longer the preserve of elites for whom the rest of society functioned, to protect them, give them the time and the space and the resources and the materials. That kind of inequality was shot through all the way, whether it was the wise men of any kind of culture anywhere in Africa or in pre-Columbian India or in pre-Columbian America or in India or in China, everywhere there was normally a small group of men with great power, cultural power, who were allowed to think. So the reconfiguration of the classical view of philosophy is one kind of challenge. So where we don't have, as it were, a particular kind of hierarchy. But when it comes to questioning philosophy in a more fundamental way as to its history, asking ourselves how we think in a more open way, ground up, to face the questions of now, who does philosophy, with what background, what do they look back on, what do they look forward to? I think we have barely begun to relate these two kinds of challenges when we talk about having to move on from a particular kind of West-centric notion of philosophy. But I thought that yesterday and today has been one of the very rare places where we brought together those kinds of voices and that kind of conversation together. Thank you. much.